I think, but not as bad. But Begin was then banned from the Knesset for several months as a result of this. So this wasn't just something passing by. Okay, so now what I want to do is quickly go through his history, and then, because we've done it before, and then focus on the new historians, as I call them, the new stuff that's coming out, and the problematic stuff that's coming out, and the controversial stuff that's coming out. Okay, so have a look. Important to remember that his whole family was murdered in the Holocaust. He was the only one who got to Palestine, what was Palestine in those days. His father was a real Zionist of the Herzl model. And he came from rabbis and so on, as you can see. And one of the interesting sort of side things of this is that Arik Sharon's grandmother was the midwife at his birth, which is also unbelievable. I mean, you think of the chances of that happening. Yeah, anyway. He joined Beitar at a very early age because that became his platform for what he did thereafter. So 14, and I can relate to that because I became a passionate member of Abonim at 10. And I know what the passion means. Oh, I can relate to it, put it that way. I mean, I'm not going to put myself in the same model, obviously, right? God help us. Although he studied law, he never practiced it. But he became a key disciple of Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was his god. Well, it wasn't because he didn't know, but no. Because Beitar was his platform, and there were groups all over Europe, he traveled all over, and that's where he met his wife, who he married in 1939. But they weren't together until he eventually got to Palestine, which was a few years afterwards, you'll see. When the Germans invaded Poland, he fled to Vilnius, to Lithuania, but then the Russians came. And he got sent to the Gulag for a long time. But after the German invasion of Russia, he was released from the Gulag. I mean, it's unbelievable when you can see what was happening, right, during time, and how people were moving. Take just one personal story, and eventually his story is just quite unbelievable. Eventually, in May 1942, the height of the war, right? El Alamein hasn't happened yet, right? The Germans are conquering left, right, and center, including North Africa. And remember last week I spoke about the danger of if the Germans had conquered Egypt and marched into Palestine, al-Husseini and the Arab Nazis or the Arabs that supported the Nazis at the time were waiting and well armed. A very dangerous time. And as I said before, his family were all murdered in the Holocaust. So the Holocaust for him is also a very, very personal issue, as it is for most of that leadership, right? Even those in the Yishuv, like Ben Gurion and Sharet and Eshkol, who had family in the Holocaust, all of them. But for Begin, this was more than that because he had gone through the Germans, the Russians, he'd been moved around, and he gets to the issue. But he, from the outset, is a huge critic of the issue. And you'll see in a minute why, when I talk about his ideology. His ideology and what he believed in terms of force differed fundamentally from Ben Gurion's, not in the end game, not in the goal, but in the means of getting there. And sometimes the end doesn't justify the means. That's where I come from. You'll see why in a minute, right? So he joins the Irgun. right from the beginning. And he becomes the leader in 1944. And he studied, remember, he's a very bright guy, right? So he'd studied India and he'd studied Ireland and he'd studied all the underground movements and the terrorist movements, because remember, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. Ask Margaret Thatcher, she'll tell you. But the most important thing is he developed his own particular ideology. Now, you won't be able to read this now. Don't worry about it now, because you'll get it when I send you the recording. But the important things here was that force was fundamental to Begin's ideology. The only way you were going to get the British out of Palestine is by creating such, I don't know, danger for them, that they would then turn on the issue itself, which would have a double effect, like, you know, one effect leads to another, and at the end of the day, they would be forced to leave Palestine. But because the British were fighting the Germans, his compromise was that the targets that they were going to attack would only be government and police targets, not society in general, and certainly not army type of things, because the Germans had to be defeated. Once the Germans are almost more or less defeated, 1944, right? Things have gone desperately wrong with Operation Barbarossa on the Russian front for the Germans, on the Eastern Front. The Brits and the Americans are preparing for the Normandy landings, which they know are coming. And everybody more or less, this is going to take a bit longer than they thought, but it doesn't matter. So the 1st of February, 1944, the Irgun declares a revolt. But where do they get their money from? Like a mafia, protection money. Literally. The biggest mistake that was made by the Irgun Melech in particular, right, who were the crazies of their time, if you like, they assassinated Lloyd Moyne. Now, Lloyd Moyne was one of Churchill's closest friends. And Churchill, from being very, very proactive in terms of the Jewish state, said, hang on a minute, there's one step too far. And the backlash from the British government was quick in coming, right? And they decided, so when people say, oh, the Brits supported the Arabs, the Brits gave arms to the Arabs, the Brits did everything they could to stop the Jews having a state. That's where history starts getting tweaked, and that's where things like the Alta Lena, which I'm going to come to in a minute, when you say possibly, or you start tweaking the historical facts, historians like me go crazy. And this is one of them. The Brits were up in arms over Lord Moyne's assassination. And we haven't come to the King David yet. The Brits went on what was called the hunting season. What was the hunting season? They went looking for Irgun members. The Yishuv leadership, in order to try and placate the British at the time, gave up names. Now, here's part of the debate. What kind of Jew gives up other Jews who are fighting for the same end to the enemy? That was Begin's big first of the myth, right? The myth that's first created is that Begin stopped a civil war because he told his men not to retaliate or resist arrest. I have yet to see written evidence of that, although people are quoting it left, right, and center. Remember, where the big issue comes on the Alta Lena, but certainly not here. Ben Gurion stepped back from the brink and in fact capitulated when he realized that the British weren't going to make any concessions. And in fact, Churchill and the government were so angry that it was not clear whether, and he had said they were not clear in whether they were planning to let the state get created or not. Chaim Weizmann was putting a lot of pressure on the British government because he had a lot of contacts and he was well respected, as we all know. And there was this thing on Agatha, right, where again, part of the hunting season was called, right? They were capturing, in inverted commas, Irgun fighters. And Begin, here's the big thing. Begin ordered the attack on the King David Hotel. Nobody else. Now, the big controversy is whether a warning was given or not. Now, depending where you sit on the historical fence, will you decide how important the warning was. The hawkish right wing are adamant that a warning was given to a guy who was named Sir something Shaw. John Shaw. John Shaw, thank you, Sir John Shaw. He was the British representative, the highest British representative in Palestine at the time, based in Jerusalem. He has maintained, and he sued two newspapers who claimed that he had received a warning and he hadn't done anything about it. And they withdrew and retracted their comments that they published. So there's no conclusive evidence about Sir John Shaw. There is no doubt that Begin was the one who gave the order for the King David Hotel. Remember, 91 people were killed. This isn't 3 or 4. This isn't 9 on the Alta Lena. And many of them were civilians. In fact, most of them were civilians. So the King David Hotel is not something that can just be passed off as, well, it was an incident. It wasn't an incident. It was a major, major issue. Now, the next part of the controversy here, of the new stuff that's coming out, there were 3 major what I call major influential operations that Menachem Begin ordered. The first one was a result of the night of the beatings. What they did was the British caught civilians and they beat them. So Begin orders the same. I just want to show you what, I'll come back to this. This is what they put up on poles, you know, it's kind of what the Irgun put up. You can read the English there. I'll read it just in case people can't read it. A Hebrew soldier taken prisoner by the enemy was sentenced by an illegal British military court, in inverted commas, to the humiliating punishment of flogging. We warn the occupation government not to carry out this punishment, which is contrary to the laws of soldiers' honor. If it is not put into effect, every officer of the British occupation army in Eretz Israel will be liable to be punished in the same way, to get 10 whips. And it's signed by the Irgun HaTzva'i HaLeumi, which is in Hebrew. Now, you could take that and you could substitute the word Irish anywhere along the line if you wanted to. And that was, you know, again, Begin's thing. So I'm coming back to this. So that was the one. The second one was the Akka prison breakout, which if you've seen the movie with Paul Newman, you'll see them all escaping from Akka prison. And then the sergeant's affair, which I know about, where they hung 3 guys and they hung the sergeants. Now, by this stage, the British had realized that there was no way they could regain control of Palestine. Now, remember, the Arabs are also going crazy here in the meanwhile, right? We're just talking about Menachem Begin here. In 1929, there was a massacre in Hebron. In 1936, there was a massacre in Jerusalem. Don't forget, don't take this out of context, right? So it's not only the British, but they realized, remember, this is after the war. Britain is bankrupt. The Americans are pouring all their aid into Germany because they're scared of the Russians. So the Marshall Plan doesn't include Britain. That's why the Germans are where they are today and where we are today, basically because of the Marshall Plan. We're still paying off, I think last year we finished paying off the Lend-Lease agreement on all the ships that the Americans supposedly sent to us. So Britain is bankrupt. And there's no way that they're going to hang on to this mandate. So what do? As we've seen before, they pass the mandate onto the United Nations and say, you know what, you guys deal with it. And then there's the vote. And now we come to probably one of the biggest issues of Begin and the Irgun and Lehi and Etzel and history. Now, Howard Epstein, in his lecture on Sunday night, went into great depth of the history of going all the way back to Hillel Cook and raising money in America, and right the way through from the 1930s, right the way through to the Alta Lena. Not once was the name Deir Yassin mentioned. Not once. Not only that, but a book was published about it 6 months ago by a guy by the name of, I can't remember his name, I'll think of it and I'll put it up there, who maintains that the Deir Yassin never took place. And the only reason it's coming out the way it is because the methodology of historians was wrong. It's outrageous. We know that the Deir Yassin took place. We also know, by the way, that was published just a few weeks ago, that under the beach at Tantura, for people who've been to the beach at Tantura, which is a little bit north of Netanya, is a mass grave. There are stories of massacres coming out of 48 that are only coming out now. Whereas what was accepted as part of the historical birth of the country were 12 very serious massacres by the IDF. They're now talking about finding at least another 36. Now, these aren't massacres of hundreds of people or scores of people. These are massacres of women and children in villages. So my point, why I'm getting so angry and why I take this so seriously, is because to take history and to tweak it to fit your ideology is playing with fire. Things happen in war. Soldiers do things in war that they shouldn't do, including the IDF. And I've served in the IDF and I know what it's about. The IDF is a phenomenal army and it's as moral as it tries to be. But war is not a good place to be in, especially in 1948, and especially when the birth of the country is days old. As a result, because there was uncertainty by the Yishuv leadership of when to declare the state, a myth has come about now that Ben Gurion was in fact thinking about not declaring the state in May and asking the Brits to stay on. I'm waiting to see evidence of this. What's the evidence? The evidence is that in January, February, March, April 1948, Ben Gurion met with a foreign minister, I forget who it was at the time, I think it was that, I'm not sure it was that, I don't know who it was anyway, at the Gloucester Hotel in London. They met face to face. No reporters, no aides, no minutes, No, nothing. Ben Gurion said to him, they didn't have enough money in the hotel to keep the heating on. He had to sit in his coat. The myth that's developed right there is, what didn't they discuss? Not what did they discuss. And maybe they discussed delaying the declaration of the state. There's no concrete evidences. And you'll know from when we spoke about Ben Gurion, the greatness or the sharpness or the brilliance of Ben Gurion was he wrote very little down. Ben Gurion gave orders by word of mouth, so that when they came to look at history like we're doing now, you can't say, whoops, but Ben Gurion did, or Ben Gurion wrote, or Ben Gurion ordered. When Ben Gurion gave orders, he told Yigal Yadin, I don't want to see Lida Airport not in our hands. And we'll see when we talk about Yitzhak Rabin, what happened at Lud. And if you've read many books, you'll know what happened in Lud. Because that airport and that area was absolutely critical to the creation of the state. But look to see if Ben Gurion gave order, you'll never find it. Begin, I'm rushing here because we're going to rush out and run out of time, but there's so much here. Begin is declared the most wanted man in Palestine. Okay, there's a bounty of 10,000, and 10,000 pounds is a lot of money, dead or alive. So he goes underground. Okay? And they can't find him, of course, right? It's underground. This is still before the state is born. And
if I want to speak, will I be able to?
You will in a minute. Don't worry, I'll give you plenty of time. You weren't here in the beginning, unfortunately, because that was going to be your time to have a go at me. But we'll be time, I promise you. We now come to the most important affair of the whole lot, which David and I are not going to be happy with. The lecture, David, were you at the lecture on Sunday night, by the way? Because that's what I asked right in the beginning.
So
you just nod your head if you were. Just say yes or no. No, go on.
Yes, you can.
Nod your head if you were.
Yeah, because it's on.
It's on.
Yeah, I don't want to hear you. Just nod your head. Put yourself on mute. Just nod your head if you were at the lecture on Sunday night by Howard Epstein. You were. Brilliant. Okay, hopefully you heard what I said right in the beginning. I don't know. Maybe you missed it. But this was a lecture on the Alter Len, as I said, for people who were there at the beginning. I was furious after this lecture because this lecture did for history what it shouldn't have done. Language is important. So when you talk about, well, possibly the first shot was from the ship. There's no such a thing as possibly. There is evidence. When you talk about, well, maybe Rabin was on the beach or not, we're not sure, but Rabin was not there. We know where he was. The most important thing about the Alter Len, this is where David and I disagree fundamentally. We agree that's been a real problem as far as history. But where we disagree fundamentally is in this. Menachem Begin believed, and I think he believed, right? I'm sure he believed, that he had stopped a civil war. The word civil war is not fitting regarding the Alter Len. It was a skirmish. What would have happened if the Alter Len hadn't been sunk is there would have been a civil war. Why? Because the Irgun fighters would have been in separate units within Tzahal, within the IDF, almost like militias. And Israel in no way could have created a state. Remember, the state here is 39 days old. This is June, July 1948. Within the leadership of the Yishuv, and this is where Howard Epstein's lecture was actually very good in one element, of talking about the pressures that Ben Gurion was under, from the left and the right, okay? He had Mapam on the left, the communists who were crazy, as extreme of the general Zionists on the right, and the Irgun and Begin and everybody else. And he's going to navigate creating the state through this maze of difficulties. No different from today, by the way, right? You can look there. In August 1948, the state's created. He comes out from thing. He forms the Cherut Party. Now, it's interesting the definition that some of important historical people, these I just took two, right? There's a whole lot more. Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt have described Menachem Begin as a terrorist and a leader of a right-wing chauvinist organization. I don't buy that, by the way. Okay, because again, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. And I'll keep going back to that. I don't agree with the ideology, and and again, we can discuss that in more depth at another time. But, and here is something I've always said over and over and over again. History and politics is also about personal chemistry between people. When leaders meet, if they don't get on as individuals, as humans, as people, there are problems. Ben Gurion and Begin didn't dislike each other. They hated each other. It's hard to believe, but there was such animosity. And it also centered primarily around German reparations. Begin was absolutely in his DNA that there's no amount of money that you could put on the blood of the Holocaust. Ben Gurion and the other pragmatists knew that in 1952, if the country didn't get the money from Germany, and it was huge amounts of money, by the way, huge amounts, the country would not survive. Couldn't. They were, remember also what was happening this time, and we saw it in the last block. The Sephardi Mizrahi communities from the Arab countries were arriving in their hundreds of thousands. The Ma'abarot had to be built. People couldn't be kept in tents. The economy had to be established. So the pragmatists said, hang on, if we don't take this money, what is the legacy that the 6 million who died leave behind them? Huge issue. And don't for 1 minute underestimate the ramifications of this reparations problem. But through all the years, Begin never, ever gained political momentum. He always trailed wildly behind Labour, right? The Chairut party then became Gachal and then became Likud, never, ever established any kind of serious political alternative until we come to 77, obviously, right? We'll get there. And in 1966, Ehud Olmert was in the Gachal party at the time. He actually called for Begin's resignation from the party, or as leader of the party, not from the party, leader of the party. But then, on the eve of the Six-Day War, a national unity government was formed. Gachal, which had from Chairut become Gachal, joined the unity government. And Begin remained in the government until August 1970. You know, people have forgotten that, right? From 67 to 70, he was a member of the government. And then comes the real upheaval of Israeli society. And probably the biggest legacy, Begin's legacy starts here. They win the election. Again, because people like me had got involved in setting up a new party called Dash that got 17 seats in the Knesset, which would have gone to Labour. And going to sleep, we thought we'd done a great deal. We'd changed the world. Woke up the next morning to find that Yigal Yadin, the leader of the party that I was involved in, I already was active in that party, used to schlep up and down all the kibbutzim in Israel, getting people to vote, had signed an agreement with Menachem Begin to form a coalition government. And he made a speech of all speeches, the mother of all speeches. He quoted from the Gettysburg Address. He quoted from the Torah. He made because he was an orator. But Menachem Begin was a great orator as well as a rebel rouser. He could do both. Netanyahu learned a lot from him. So they formed the government, major reforms internally, right? The economy, all kinds of things, big changes. Regulation was pulled back. You went from a socialist-based kind of ideology to a capitalist-based ideology through an election. And then, of course, he gets involved in serious politics. The Camp David Accords, he gets the Nobel Peace Prize in 1978 with Sadat. Remember? Sadat comes to Jerusalem. This is huge, right? We happened to be in Jerusalem that day, funnily enough. We had to walk, I don't know where we were going. We actually saw the motorcade go past. I waved to Sadat. I still wave my hand like this when I wave, right? I waved to anyway. When Sadat came to Israel, if anybody who was there at the time, will know that up until the time that the doors opened of the plane, no one was quite sure what was going to happen. In fact, they had snipers on the roof of Ben Gurion Airport because they weren't sure that there might be a suicide squad coming out the plane, because on the red carpet at the bottom of the airplane staircase was the whole Israeli political leadership. Everybody. From the president right the way through the Supreme Court, everybody was there. And I remember we sort of said, anyway, so that comes, and that's huge. He makes a speech in the Knesset. The fact that the peace never took off from the Egyptian people's side, that's another story on its own. And of course, Sadat was assassinated for what he did. And that upholds a lot of David's argument, for example, which we'll have later, about any Arab leader who wants to make peace with Egypt, with Israel, will be assassinated. There's your example. So that's number one. The second thing that was really enormous was the decision to bomb the Iraqi reactor in 1981. I remember that as well. It was during Shavuot. People were going out to the fields on kibbutz. You have a very special chag on Shavuot. And on the radio, we all had to say, the Iraqi nuclear reactor is being bombed. Had that not been bombed, the first Iraq war might have looked a hell of a lot different to what it did when it did. So that was important. Then we come to the Lebanon invasion. And Sabra and Shatila and the Kahan Commission, I'm going to just mention all those three together. Because Arik Sharon is involved here. Arik Sharon is Begin's defense minister. And Arik Sharon convinces Begin that, it was in 1982, that Israel needs to invade Lebanon and push the PLO, who had literally taken over southern Lebanon at the time, back 40 kilometers. The original aims of the first Lebanese war, if you've seen the video I sent around, the first Lebanon war goes into this in great detail, was 40 kilometers. Sharon had other plans, like Arik Sharon always had. And when we do Sharon, you'll see his legacy. And Sharon pushed on, took Damascus, you know the story, let the Christian militia into the refugee camps, terrible slaughter, women and children. The Kahan Commission finds Arik Sharon personally responsible for not stopping the massacre. Israel didn't carry out the massacre. But Israel was responsible for there not being a massacre. That was the underlying, that was what came out of the commission. I'm not going to go into it now. As a result, Begin resigns. His wife Eliza died a few months beforehand. I'm trying to think of the right words. That affected him unbelievably. He resigns, goes into almost isolation. Hughes, like Hughes in his day, people never saw him, and then he died. but his legacy is huge. I don't use that word too much, but that's what it is. First of all, the animosity between him and Ben-Gurion left the kind of atmosphere of animosity between leaders. Rabin and Netanyahu, Peres and Netanyahu, Ulmart and Rabin. These are the kind of things that had the undercurrent of personal animosity. That's number one. Number two, his virulent opposition to reparations. He was a great believer in Yehuda v'Shomron. Now remember, the first settlements in Yehuda v'Shomron were not as a result of the Likud party. It was because of labor of Shimon Peres and Yitzchak Rabin at a place called Sebastia, which had been an ex-railway station, which the settlers took over. People I used to debate against, Hanan Porat, great guys, Zichronon Livracha, from the absolute opposite side of the spectrum. They went and they settled in Sebastia, and Rabin and Peres decided to turn it into an army camp. That was the first. You can go and check your history now, all the people with iPhones. Go and see if I'm right or if I'm right. So don't for 1 minute think, but his view, and Beitar always believed in Shtei Gadot, right? Two banks, both sides of the Jordan. You see the Beitar Chamesha, what's it called? Chamsha, I think it is, whatever. Right, they've got a thing, we want Shlichut with guys from Beitar, right, who had, they used to wear the emblem of what Israel should be. Not two sides of the Jordan. The Likud party is a result of his baby. No doubt about it. I personally believe that the first cornerstones of the social divide were laid in Begin's first term of office after 77, with the capital regulations taken away. The peripheral towns like Kiryat Shmone and Sderot and these places didn't gain anything, and they still haven't, but they still vote for the Likud. That's another story, right? But the social divide, and Israel's got a huge social divide. Don't for 1 minute think that there isn't a social divide in Israel. There's Tel Aviv, and there's Kiryat Shmone. There's the Haredim, and there's LGBTQ plus communities. You know, you'll find this all the way along the line. And I think part of the stuff, but that's again a personal. And I think the final part of it is Benjamin Netanyahu is the birth baby of Menachem Begin and the period of the Likud, going back to Gachal, going back to Cheirut, going back to the Irgun. Okay, that's me. It's now open up for David to let rip. You've got your period now, I'm sure. Hang on. I have to end my share so we can see.